So let's get down to business with today's panel session, and we do have a very impressive lineup today. We are delighted to welcome Mark Griffin, board member of the US Chemical Safety Investigation Board, Les Linklater, team leader at Step Change in Safety, Susan McKenzie, Head of Energy Division at the Health and Safety Executive, and Jake Malloy, RMT Union Regional Organiser. I believe you're all mic'd up, ladies and gents, so if you'd like to make your way to the stage, we'll get started. Les and Jake. Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Good morning. Thank you for coming. Les, I would like to start with you. Now, we are here today to talk about risk and safety. Part of the mechanism used to both see and mitigate risk is represented by various feedback and reporting systems. Many companies incentivise the safety performance. Should safety performance ever be linked to financial reward?
Well, there's a difficult question to start with. I guess simply the short answer is no. I mean, the financial reward for being safe is actually going home. You know, at an individual level, you know, we get paid. You know, we go to work to be safe, to go home, to spend time with the people that, you know, and do the things we care about most. So I have a sort of, let's say, conflict with incentivising to being safe, because in itself, you know, the rewards are good enough. You know, having all your digits intact, looking after yourself and your colleagues should be significant. It should be enough of a reward for anybody to consider being safe in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Susan, what would your take be on that?
I've got direct experience of other industries where actually the bonus system has actually actively got in the way of safety, where people have been incentivised for productivity. Well, actually, they've been told they've been incentivised for safety as well, but actually this was an organisation that was struggling financially, and all the targets that were driven from the centre and the top were actually for production, whilst they were saying actually you would get bonuses for safety. I was talking to one of the senior leaders in the North Sea a couple of weeks ago, and he has started, and this is something that actually has challenged some of my thinking. One of the questions he's posing in his team is actually, should he incentivise his team for performance against the leading indicators for process safety? So actually rewarding and actually giving some incentives in that area. So he started at the moment looking at just a small way, safety critical maintenance backlog. Now you can argue that that's not entirely a leading indicator, but actually he's bringing in his senior managers. He's looking at the safety critical maintenance backlogs in all of his installations. He's asking if they need more resource, and he's actually actively rewarding those who are staying on top of the safety critical maintenance backlog. And that to me actually challenges some of my thinking previously, although I agree with Les, you know, everybody should be coming home safe.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it fosters an open and honest reporting system then?
Absolutely not.
No.
Absolutely not. If you incentivise people for for their occupational accidents, that just drives down reporting, in my experience.
Jake, you're shaking your head there. You agree with that?
Yeah, I'm not convinced by the incentivising the safety critical maintenance backlog area either. I've got first-hand experience of manipulation, shall we say, of safety critical maintenance backlog, where senior managers believed, based on the paperwork and the computer inputs provided, that the safety maintenance was ahead of the game, when in actual fact it was well behind the game, and could have killed 155 people. And fortunately, you might say, but it only killed 2, and that's because of a safety critical maintenance backlog which management believed to be, as I say, ahead of the game. So I'm not convinced by that, and I'm certainly not convinced by the idea that we incentivise safety. That is demonstrably a deterrent to reporting. People do not report in order to ensure they get their bonus. So I'd be opposed to both, personally.
Do your members say that they are scared to report, even though it is supposed to be an open system?
I've got members of my family that have told me that don't report because it jeopardises the crew's bonus and the drilling side of things. So it's out there, it's happening now, yeah.
And it must be quite frustrating because, you know, years have been spent trying to change this and make it an open system where you should not be fearful for your job or for your financial reward, your bonus.
Right. I mean, we've definitely seen this in some of our investigations. The award bonus tie can limit what gets reported or how things are done on the rig. I think sometimes senior management will have a message of safety first, but they're sending sort of a mixed message to middle management in that productivity is everything for the middle manager, and your performance is judged on that. So I think it is a challenge. You know, then you have the question that the issue that Jake raised of if you try to tie in performance metrics into the middle manager's performance review, then there's potential for gaming that system, for not really getting the true numbers back. But I think there's got to be some way to look at a different way to evaluate your middle managers to make sure that they are sending the same message up and down the chain that senior managers are sort of saying in slogans, that it has to be implemented on the ground. So.
I'm going to stay with you, Mark. Even though this industry has focused on safety for years, and it's ingrained at all levels, from the secretary who will never leave the office to the worker offshore, why are we still not incident-free?
That's a great question. I mean, I think, I'm sure several in the audience have looked at the U.S. Chemical Safety Board reports, and one thing that strikes me is that after several years of experience in this field, we're still seeing this trend of looking at personal safety, personal injury rates as a metric to drive down process safety incidents. And I think it's very clear that those two are not linked. And in the States, actually, we have a system where the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, they drive their inspections based on injury rates. So if you have a low lost time injury rate reported on personal injuries, you're less likely to get inspected. That misses the point of the process safety aspect completely. So I think it really, you know, it really strikes us that we continue to see this. And even in conferences such as this one, I've been on panels where I'll talk to industry on the side, and they'll be really in line with what I'm saying, and then they'll start their presentation off by showing a graph of their LTIRs and how they're reducing over years, and how great this is for this company X. And I'm thinking, boy, that's just the wrong message. So I think we really have to start looking at process safety indicators and how we're performing it on the process level, not just focusing on injuries. Both are important, but we have to look at the process side more seriously.
Les, do you think that's achievable?
I live in a world where everything's achievable and constantly frustrated when we're let down. So I think we do have incident-free days. I think the challenge is actually that we don't, you know, and to pick up some of the points that Ella made earlier, we don't share how we achieve those, and we don't learn. You know, we can stand up and say, you know, what went wrong or what's going right, but how we translate that into our current practices in the widest sense is one of the key missings. You know, so there are, you know, right across, you know, there's, let's say 16,000 people offshore, of which, you know, let's hope the vast majority will have an incident-free day today. But how do you do it again tomorrow and the day after and the day after that? That's about sharing, that's about learning, and that's about common practice, harmonisation, and this continual improvement cycle. And that's the real challenge.
How do you think that they could do that, though?
Well, I mean, the easy answer is get the lawyers out of the room first, so we start sharing, because they tend to get in the way. You know, if I forgive any lawyers in the room, but the fact is that, you know, there is a sense that, you know, if you think about even only the UK, there is a common sense that if we produce more safely, there is a benefit for us all, and it's that collective responsibility for safety that I think sometimes we miss. You know, we talk a lot about personal responsibility, which means I'm okay. But how do you make sure your colleague's okay, your team's okay, your organisation's okay, and also the organisation who's in the building next to you is okay? So we have to think about this in societal terms as opposed to individualistic.
Susan, what would you say to that? I mean, you work in
Yeah,
this.
I absolutely agree with Mike. I have to say, I think the industry, my experience, is focused far too much on its occupational health and safety performance. And some of you will have heard me say this before, but actually I was stunned to find out I was going to be 50% more likely to have a lost time accident in my office than actually was in the oil and gas sector. So that says to me we've got an industry that actually has got a proper focus on occupational health and safety. But I think actually my suspicion is that's easy. Actually, that's easy. It's the visible stuff. You can see when people aren't wearing their PPE. You can see when there's liquid on the floor. That's the easy stuff. I think process safety, actually, because some of it is almost invisible or embedded. How do you know whether how corroded that pipe is on the inside? How do you know whether the right fluid is actually flowing through that pipe? That's much more challenging. So actually, as a regulator, I think it's important that actually I try to focus the industry's attention much more on its process safety performance rather than its occupational health and safety performance. And actually, that's what I'm trying to do. I think I'm really struck as well. Les is absolutely right. I don't think the industry is good at sharing lessons. It tends to share lessons when things go wrong. It learns them, or some of them learn them for a wee while, and then actually people forget. So either the leadership at the organisation changes, or actually there's been another incident, we take our eye off that ball, we move on to something else. And I think actually for me, it's what I'm looking to see is actually the industry almost gets back to basics. And actually, once it thinks it's got something cracked, it must come back to it and look again and continually monitor its performance. I mean, my chair says, there are no new reasons for incidents, there are just new incidents, and I think she's absolutely right.
Les, sorry, Jacob, what would you say?
Yeah, I would agree with Mark.
Mark, sorry.
Yep. Sorry. The LTIs, the LTIs should have been scrapped years ago. It's an appalling measurement to use to improve safety. But picking up what Les was saying as regards involving workers, engaging workers, that we've got good examples which tie into backlogs and maintenance strategy and stuff of workers involved in that process. So it can be done. If you get a good active safety committee of safety representatives who are monitoring the operator in their compliance with safety critical element, backlogs and maintenance, performance standards and the like, then you've got a safe installation. And it's maintained to the level it should be and operating at the standards it should be, and is being audited and reviewed by the people most at risk. So it can be done. There's good examples right now here in the UK, but the key is involving and engaging the workforce, as Lord Cullen would. So
you're all agreed that the sharing of the information would really help the process?
Absolutely.
Yeah, but you have to learn. Sharing's not enough. There is absolutely no point in us creating, a perfect mechanism for sharing. We have to demonstrate we're capable of learning, and that's the key in sustaining that.
So what can sorry.
I was just going to add to the sharing. I mean, some of the concerns I have is that the mentality that it couldn't happen here, that even with Macondo, I think there's a lot and a lot of lessons to be learned there for all installations, but sometimes the immediate reaction is, oh, that couldn't happen at our facility, and I think that's got to change. If this is going to be a tipping point, as we said in the opening, I think that mentality has to change. That you have to realize, in fact, there are lessons for all facilities to learn from, and I argue all the time that not only in your sector, but look beyond your sector. In our reports, we try to, as Lord Cullen said, we try to go beyond the human error or the technical failure and look higher up at the organizational failure, because we think there's commonality there and there's lessons to be learned across sectors. And but people have to actually not only sharing but the learning from that is
And do
important.
you think that would be the best way to drive and influence safer behaviours?
I think that's a starting point anyway. Yes. Now safer behaviors is an interesting phrase too. I think I think of it as more organizational change. Sometimes. At least my view is that when you talk behavior, you can get focused on the holding the handrail, putting on the hard hat, how people behave, the personal safety side of things. If you're looking at organizational behavior, It's a different element, and how organizations look at these lessons learned is important.
You look wistful when I mentioned safer behaviours.
Well, yeah, I have. So here's the bit that we challenge the room, I guess, because I think behavioural safety is a bit of a myth, because ultimately what you get is a Pavlovian response. So it's almost at the point where the bell rings, the dog salivates, and as if by magic we've solved the problem. So what we have is a hold a handrail, a lid on cup, and a card to say this will make you safe. And ultimately, if you don't understand why, and why you're doing these things in the first place, and the purpose and intent of these things, then it just becomes an automatic response. And there's a layer below behaviour in terms of attitude or values or whatever else it is that you need to get into. So, the surface, everything looks okay, and that's one of the challenges of kind of getting to the next level of sort of safety performance is we need to move beyond behaviour and into kind of our individual and collective attitude towards safety, so that we don't just follow the rules. We understand why the rules are there and what they mean to us, and why, if we follow them, we'll go home, as opposed to there's a big poster on the wall and somebody says we have to do it.
And tick the box.
Yeah.
Susan, the UK has had its Piper Alpha in Buncefield, the US had its Macondo in Texas City, Australia had its Montara. Systems and processes have improved over the years following these incidents, but do you believe that corporate culture and companies' attitudes towards improving safety culture have led or have been led by legislation?
I think in some areas that's actually helped. I think actually I think in a lot of cases it depends what motivates the leaders of the organisations. So actually there'll be some leaders in organisations who actually genuinely, passionately believe in safety, who will be out there actively looking for the lessons to learn, will take that back into their company and do something about it. There are other people who need to be encouraged, shall we say. And I think an example of that for me is I wrote out to the industry to talk to them about their hydrocarbon performance, and I asked the leaders of industry to write back and tell me what they were personally doing to improve health and safety and to reduce hydrocarbon releases in their business and across the industry. Only just over half responded by the deadline. So that's in response to a letter from the regulator. And actually, when we've analysed the results, more than half, well over half of them, have made no personal commitment back in the letters to safety. They talk in the we term. There are only 10 leaders in industry that responded who've actually said there are at least 3 things they are personally doing. So that actually suggests to me that there are groups of people who are motivated and will respond without being dragged to doing things by the regulator. And there are other people in this sector who actually need to feel the warmth of the embrace of the regulator, and the legislation is there to provide that.
What's your view, Jake?
The warmth of the regulator is a great way of putting it. Well, you need a robust regulator, because if you haven't got a robust regulator, nothing's going to change. It's as simple as that. And there's lots of examples, you've alluded to a few of them already. And there'll be more. There'll be more because there's a reluctance in certain cultures, certain jurisdictions to put in place a robust regulator and legislate in a way which makes the corporate body accountable and responsible. It's a fact. Anybody doesn't hold with that idea is frankly living in a cave or in a dream world. We need to change that, and as we talked about yesterday, this group, Society of Petroleum Engineers, could do a great deal to change that. They're a global organisation, 110,000 members. I wish I had a union that size, we could change the world. But these people can influence it on the ground. They can exert that influence and try to change things on their patch for the better, because there's examples of best practice globally that can be adopted in different jurisdictions. But the key has to be a robust regulator. Without that regulator there, even with the SPE pushing it, there's going to be pushback and resistance to change, unfortunately.
Do you think now is the time to have a conference like this on safety and risk? Are you waiting for something else to happen?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. I mean, I was in Houston 2 years ago at the invite of the US Chemical Safety Board to listen to views about how things had changed. But I'm not convinced a lot has changed. I'm not convinced that you won't have another Macondo in the Gulf of Mexico. But then I'm not convinced that we won't have a Macondo event west of Shetland, given what I've seen in the last few weeks. It's the same here. We need to get down to the ground, as Les has said, and make people understand what the risks are and how we manage them and engage them in that to avoid these events. These are the people who matter most.
But Mark, it is inherently a dangerous business. And so you're always going to have risk. Is it ever acceptable to say, well, you know, that we are humans, we're not machines, you know, that mistakes will happen and we have to just take that element of risk?
I think that's the nature of this business is you have, you know, really low probability but you know, high consequence incidents that could occur. And, you know, to take the risks, it's a nature of some of the exploration business that you're going to take commercial risks. But you certainly have to, I think, understand that commercial risks are not necessarily at odds with operating safely, and that you have to consider both when they're operating. And you know, to go back to your last question, I mean, I don't think you can. I certainly know there's attempts at this, but I'm not sure we can legislate culture. You know, that change, I think, has to happen organizationally in an organization. There is legislation in the States that's starting to look at what I would call symptoms of culture to see maybe that there's problems with a safety culture in an organization. But I also think that you can't really legislate and say, you know, we're going to make a law that changes the culture on oil rigs. I think that has to happen in an organization. And perhaps part of that is that understanding that commercial risk is not necessarily at odds with safety, and that you know, that production can occur safely. It's part of your business. It's not an add-on layer.
And Les, Lord Cullen touched on it, that you have to have consistency in your safety values from the top down.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it's almost, you know, and top down, I think it's a myth. You have to have it from the bottom up. You know, I think the workforce fundamentally are the key to driving change in this. You know, there are many, many more members of the workforce who work in a major hazard environment than there are leaders sitting in corner offices around Aberdeen and other parts of the world. You know, so there are 25,000 core offshore workers. So there's your kind of motivation, there's your who we need to engage. They live in that environment. So it's their built environment, it's their processes, and they ultimately have the capability, if we enable them, to make the real difference. So yes, it has to be led from the top, but you have to enable the guys and the girls at the work sites to make that change.
Whenever there's been a major incident or a disaster, you know, tighter legislation has been enforced and adopted by the industry. But how can we make it easier to change safety cultures and behaviours without having to wait for that disaster to happen in the first place? Is it very difficult to get that through to the people working on the ground?
Well, it comes back to what we think the biggest hazard is we face every day. You know, it's when you're you know, in the office or at a work site, you know, our relationship to our own risk is entirely dependent on what we think the consequences are for me, and that influences everything else we do in a day. So, and you know, for me, if we want to make the change without legislation, it always comes back to learning, because the weak signals, the near misses, whatever else, they're all there. So if we have the capacity and the commitment to work those, analyse those, and understand where our failures are, we have the potential to solve the issues before we have to feel the warmth of the regulator. You know, and that's the ultimate objective. You know, there is sufficient data there to make change. I absolutely believe that.
Jake, do you think that that workers are slightly resistant to change if they can see that the safety cultures that they're operating with on a day-to-day basis seem to be getting them through, but you know, the regulator, for example, want to introduce a new one? Is it easy for them to change their cultures without waiting, as I say, for that incident to happen?
Through education and as Les has alluded to, sharing. You know, if workers, I talk about my own my own background, you know, we were all dealing with risks offshore. And then we went to bed on the evening of 5th of July, got up in the morning of the 6th, and we saw something that we'd never been able to comprehend. That changed everything. But if you, I mean, I've got a short clip of an incident occurred just a few months ago, and I've shown it to a group of drilling workers, well, every drilling worker I possibly can, and they're aghast. They're so shocked that that could happen. It's like Mark was alluding to, you know, it couldn't happen here. If you're able to show workers what can happen and educate them, then it's dead easy to change because they understand the risk. So it's not difficult to change them. There's no resistance to change if they're informed and they're educated about what they're changing for, what the purpose of the change is for.
Is that one of the biggest obstacles you face?
Well, I'm interested in what Jake and Les have said. I think what I see actually at all levels in offshore is actually a fundamental lack of awareness of what a perception of risk. We've got organisations who actually don't see or seem absolutely blind to some of the risks that they've actually got on their installations. And it doesn't matter whether you're the worker or the OIM, actually they have just not recognised that as a risk. And so my inspectors will come in, and as soon as when it's pointed out, some of them are then capable of responding to that. So actually, we didn't think about it. It wasn't even, it could never happen here. It was just nowhere on their psyche at all. Some organisations have been able to respond to that. Others, actually, they've got issues with their ability to assess risks. Now, I hear what you say about actually if we educate the workers, but again, what I see is a barrier potentially around about supervisor, middle manager level. So we talked earlier on about the demands on the OIM and others for production. So you can educate the workers, but actually you've still got to be able to get those messages through the organisation. And I think it is this tension between production and getting people to understand it's about producing safely, because that way you get the stuff, you keep stuff in the well, you keep it in the pipe, you get it onto the shore safely. And for me, it's that actually, that's an area where I think we really need to focus our effort.
They're workers as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay.
Is it the same in the States?
Yeah, definitely. And I see the, you know, what's happening on the line. I was struck by what we were talking about last night. We had a conversation about this, and that apparently I wasn't around, but early on when Safety Case was implemented here, there was a real effort for the engineers to work with the line workers and educate them and sort of make them understand how what they're doing could impact the overall process and overall risk of a major accident, as opposed to, I think now they're more entrenched in this, I've got to have my certain gloves on, I've got to wear a certain protective clothing. It's all about those factors and behaving and even if along with following procedures, you know, we're struck by, we found this several times, that deviance from procedure is only viewed in a negative fashion when the outcome is poor. So if workers are cutting corners, so to speak, and it does good, it increases production, it makes things go faster, and nothing happens, nobody raises an eyebrow. But the one time that they do that and it triggers a large event, they want to, you know, blame that worker and say, why didn't you follow procedure? So I think those are the little things that are not paid attention to, perhaps on various levels, because they don't see what they're doing compared to the overall risk of a major accident. Yeah.
Jake, only last week we had the tragedy in the North Sea, and a worker fell from a platform. Do your members in the RMT union believe that enough is being done by the industry, or should more of the onus of safety be placed on their shoulders?
The industry's slowly but surely, it's taken them a wee while to get to the stage I'd like to see them at, but the tools are there, the means are there, the communication channels are there by and large. It's that middle tier of management that needs to change most of all now to make sure that everything that's being promoted from the top is being delivered at the bottom.
Why do you think it's not?
Because of what Mark just said about the pressures. You know, these middle managers are dealing with the rock of commercial pressure and productivity and performance, and at the hard place of health and safety and maintaining those standards to the highest level. They've got a difficult job to do, I accept that, but where they've embraced the safety committees, the safety representatives, the procedures, etc., and have walked the line, as it were, you know, walked the talk, it works and it's delivered. Through the workforce involvement groups we've seen practical examples of safety reps delivering better performance and better safety. They work hand in hand, and that's common throughout industry. So it's educating that middle tier, that supervisor tier as well, that Susan was talking about, as to the benefits of that, and then taking the pressure off those middle managers from the top on the production side. You know, we've seen a tragedy just on a drilling rig a few days ago, where a mechanic went to change a hose and was working with 2 other supervisors to do that. And if he changed that hose and that piece of kit had gone back into operation, nothing would have been said. He went to get a new hose, came back, and the 2 supervisors had decided to do another job just to keep things going. And that job resulted in that mechanic being crushed inside this piece of kit because they decided to do another job, which was just to keep the thing going. The outcome, everybody failed to comply with procedure. Everybody failed to comply with procedure. But that would never have flagged up. That failure to comply with procedure would never have surfaced had that fatality not occurred. And that's where we're at in the real world on the drill floor. There's a lot of pressure on the guys to deliver. Downtime is money. Go, go, go. We've got to change that culture to an extent that those 2 supervisors stood by that piece of machinery, waited for the guy to come back with the hose, watched them fitted the hose, and then got on with it. But now they're saying, well, they should have stopped the job, they should have produced a procedure, they should have wrote a permit, they should have got the installation manager out his bed to sign it, they should have.
Nice. I mean, it must be frustrating because that's your whole system, your step change is designed to make sure these things, well, hopefully, you know, don't happen. It's frustrating when these things do.
I think it's a stark reminder that people make mistakes, you know, and there are, you know, so, and is it frustrating? I think it's much more than frustrating when you lost a colleague and lost somebody's life. You know, it's you know, when Jake and I had the conversation on August 23rd last year, it was, you know, at the helicopter incident, it was way beyond frustrating. It was absolutely, you know, completely devastating for many of us around the industry. Never mind, you know, the 4 families who were immediately impacted. But when we look at it, people make mistakes. So therefore, what we have to do, and it goes back exactly to what Lord Collins said, you have to build plant and equipment that manages that. You have to write process and procedure that allows for that individual to make a mistake, or that team. And ultimately, you have to build a team that is capable of dealing with human error. And once you've done that, then if you still make a mistake, you have to learn from it. So it goes back to the initial built environment, how you design the equipment, where do you locate it, all these other things. So you have to look at human factors in every part of your business. You can't comply with a procedure that's 4 inches thick, written in, you know, size 8 font, and you expect somebody to read that in half an hour. It's just not going to happen. And you talk about procedural compliance. The simplest procedure in the world is a round circle with a 30, 3 and 0 in it, right? And the vast majority of us, most days of the week, fail to comply with that. That's a simple fact. We fail to comply with a basic process, basic procedure. So you have to write procedures that set people up for success. You have to build an environment that sets people up for success. But you have to create a human system that also allows for people to make mistakes, because they will. And you know, trying to engineer it out through behavioural safety is not the answer. It's creating the widest possible system.
And is that possible, though, Mark?
Well, I mean, I go back to the incident that Jake was talking about, and the fact that, you know, one of the conclusions or the statements afterwards were that didn't follow procedures, didn't pull permits, didn't da-da-da. And I think the rich part of that story is, why not? Why weren't those things done? And it might go back to those questions of had to keep going, had the supervisors had to do multitask and do other things, and that gets into that cultural aspect or organizational aspect of, so that's the higher level question that I would want to ask if I were in that organization. Why, what were those workers? What pressures were on those supervisors that made them take those risks in that moment? And I think that's where the learnings have to occur.
I'd like to go to each of you and ask individually what you think is the biggest risk factor involved that you believe in the areas that you work in. Can I start with you, Jake? What are workers in the RMT union most concerned about at the moment?
I think now, unfortunately, it's helicopters.
Helicopters.
But I mean, taking that aside, it has to be the increase this year in hydrocarbon releases. That's the one thing that's risking all of them. We all face risks daily. Every worker faces risk daily in their individual roles. But when you consider all of the catering crew on Piper Alpha died, every single one of them. A few of them, if any, had any concept of the major accident hazards outside. That captures what the major risk is for workers out there, and that's why we need to educate them about those major accident hazards and get away from this LTI nonsense.
But it seems that, I mean, I actually had the pleasure last year of doing my offshore survival training. I was sent offshore, and it really was an eye-opener, and obviously it was at a basic level, but you do get an idea of at the start at least, of how much safety it should be at the forefront of every worker's mind. But it seems to me that that's all we hear about, that safety training, but you're saying that it's still not enough?
Well, we talk about safety training. I don't like that. Mark said, we were talking about last night, when I became a safety rep in 1990, for the first 2-3 years, because it was new, it was utopia. We had safety meetings held with constituencies, we had process engineers, we had verification engineers coming in and telling us what we were doing, why we were doing it, the systems, the mechanics were working on valves, what runs through these pipes, what does this valve do? Today, mechanics go and repair a valve without knowing anything about what that valve's function is, about what's flowing through the line. That's no safety, that's not safety training as such. That is an education about process safety and keeping the stuff in the pipe and making sure systems work as they should. That's the training that should be done. Sending them down to Port Lethe and a Pito for a couple of days or doing that is good. It gives you a practical basic knowledge, but the real training comes on the job.
It's not going to save your life. Susan, what would you say is the biggest area of risk at the moment in the industry?
I think if you ask my staff, I think some of them would talk about hydrocarbon releases because the numbers have gone up. I think we have done some analysis and actually identified that the number of majors has reduced. But I think hydrocarbon releases are key. I think the other thing that causes my inspectors a lot of concern offshore is asset integrity. Because we've got, I think over 50% of the installations we've got are way past their design life. We've got a number of installations that are 40 years old. We are in discussion with operators who want to continue to use some of these assets until they're 60 years old. So actually, I think there are huge challenges around asset integrity for the industry. And as we know, actually, things like the maintenance competes with production for beds. And I think that is a real area of concern for my inspectors at the moment.
Liz?
So, I mean, I think, surprisingly enough, I'm going to stick with Jake and Susan on the hydrocarbons. It's the hydrocarbon releases, we have a degrading performance, and that's a key issue. But picking up on major accident hazards, we have a basic industry safety training called MIST, and of which, an hour and a half is currently on major accident hazard, and there's an hour and a half on COSH. Now, you look at that in terms of balance and what is what we need to be educating people on. We're spending a huge amount of time on what is slips, trips and falls and, the lost time incident. We are not effectively educating our workforce on major accident hazard management. And the good thing is we've intervened and we're going to change that. But that is the challenge. It's major acts and hazard management for us all, be it Jake, Susan, myself, or Mark. It's the key, and that has to go from the boardroom to the shop floor. And if you have a senior leader who doesn't understand how they're managing the major hazards in this business, you've got an issue.
So you say you're working on it. I mean, how do you have a target as to when you hope to?
Well, the new improved mist will be ready by the middle of this year, or the new standard. But ultimately, it's a constant, and I think the thing is that nothing's ever finished. Okay. And I think that's the key. We sit with a basic adage in the team in Step Change that nothing's ever finished and nothing's ever beyond criticism. Now, that's not particularly a motivator, but the reality is that you have to have this relentless pursuit of continuous improvement, because even if we achieve an incident-free day today, we have to get up and do the same tomorrow. So you have to continue to improve, you have to learn the lessons, and you have to feed it forward so that you repeat today's successes.
And Mark, can I come to you?
Yeah, hard to go last on this one, but no, I think age of facility is one that we've been really at the Chemical Safety Board, we're operating beyond the design life. We see it in the States onshore with many of the refineries. Recent incident in Chevron in California, very old refinery, and so that the age of facility operating well beyond the design life is certainly a concern that we have, and how those risks are managed. We also have it in the nuclear sector in the States, where reactors are looking for new permits beyond their design life now, so that's certainly a factor. I guess the other one that we see commonly is the nature of the business that I'm in is that we investigate the major incidents, and you see this this common problem of I guess complacency gets thrown around a lot, but the idea of staying resilient. We haven't had a major release, a major problem here in years, and so therefore, can I start to cut that process safety management group a little bit? Things are a little thin this year, and where can we cut? And well, what have you done for us lately? We haven't had any problems. We'll cut there, and I think that mindset has to change. The really effective organizations have to stay resilient and be ready for surprises, and I guess that's one of the other factors we're concerned about.
Okay, I'm looking at time. We do have a few more questions, but we're due to stop this session at 15:15, and I would like to ask if any members of the audience may have any questions that they would like to put to the panel. You don't have to say your name or the organisation you work for, but does anybody have a question? Yes, if you just hold on a second, we're just going to get a mic down to you. Thank you.
My name's Cameron Ramsey. We've heard a lot about learning from lessons from the panel. We've also heard the panel speak about change. I perceive that our industry rather rarely uses its excellent procedures for management of change, management of engineering change, for management of the sort of changes we're talking about. And I keep wondering and believing that we could make progress by doing that. Any comments from the panel?
Would anyone like to start us off?
Engineering change. I'm going to agree with you. Yeah, there needs to be more done. And again, I would use the hobby horse that I've got as involving the workforce with those engineers in that change process. The management of change process right down the line is, well, there's good examples, but I only deal with bad examples, unfortunately. That's the nature of the job I'm in, and you're right, there's failures at every level of management of change, and specifically on the engineering side of things.
I'm trying to suggest that we apply those procedures which we have evolved in our industry for management of engineering change to management of organisational change and procedural change in order to get them embedded. Until that happens, I think it's all far too informal and wishy-washy.
I think when you hear any of the professors, if you go to any conference where somebody from Harvard comes to talk about change, they don't say it's only in this area or it's only for this area. I think there are some principles for managing change which actually apply regardless of whether you're talking about an engineering issue or an organisational issue. And I think actually you raise a good point. That actually, if I think about us as a regulator, a lot of our focus on the management of change is around the engineering side rather than on the organisational side. So you've given me something to think about.
Yeah, we made, you may know, we made a recommendation in our BP Texas City report for OSHA to add on in their process safety management rule to add on management of organizational change, not just management change. So we strongly support that. And looking at the refinery sector, I mean, it's a constant turnover either of a new owner, these sites switch hands, bringing in their new philosophies, bringing in their new, or even more frequently, more new middle managers. And as I've heard from workers a lot, that new middle managers will come in with their new pet certain approaches or certain ideas. And even though the workers felt strongly that some things were working very well, and they just dropped them and replaced them with something that they felt strongly about. They wanted to make their mark is the way the workers viewed it. They wanted to make their mark to climb the ladder in corporate. And so, but is that change ever considered, the impact of that change considered? And I would argue we're far behind in that area. Yeah.
I'll add that I think we do apply engineering management change process to how we manage our procedures, and I've seen many good examples of that around town. When it comes to organisational change, then it's typically led by teams of consultants or organisational specialists and things like that who don't have that engineering practice behind them. And ultimately, I'll push it back. It's the responsibility of the organisation and those that are managing the organisation to make sure the process is in place. And that's back to learning. If you have something working in design and engineering management process and how you manage those, why would you change or try to change the makeup, the construction and kind of the build of your organisation through 5 or 6 HR professionals, a whiteboard and and drawing a new organogram? It's much more fundamental, and the risk you can put into your business by getting that wrong is arguably much greater than changing a valve out or a few lines in a procedure.
Thank you for your question. We have time for one more.
I got a couple of
yes, the lady at the back.
I'd like to go back to the comments on...
Sorry, could you hold the mic just a wee bit closer? That's great.
I'd like to go back to the comments on the different metrics for personal safety and process safety, and how the belief is that they're not linked. My belief is that, so personal safety, yes, it involves the PPE and the holding the handrails and the lids on coffee cups, but it's also about the competence of staff, the training, the supervision, the leadership. Process safety, we talk about keeping hydrocarbons in the pipes, but if you delve a bit deeper into that, it comes down to design, and who designs the systems is people, and you need to have your competent people and procedures in order to achieve success in that. We talk about manufacturing of valves, of pipelines. Again, that comes down to contract management, which is people being competent in knowing what they're actually designing for. So I guess my question is, what's your definition of process safety versus personal safety? Because I believe, and it goes back to what Ella said, that the tipping point should maybe not to define the two as two separate things, but just look at safety as itself, because I think they are inherently linked.
Who would you like to direct your question to?
Anybody that's brave enough to answer, I guess.
I suppose I can. I think I made that statement, so I suppose I can
well,
start.
then the market's yours.
But I think I may. The way you defined it does sort of overlap things. So and that's good. I'm looking at it more from the standpoint of how it's traditionally looked at in the United States from the rate, and part of it is driven by, our Occupational Safety and Health Administration put in place this reporting criteria to report lost time incident rates, and they define these as, you know, the slips, trips, and falls and those sorts of things. And those metrics, you know, that has a trickle effect of all, you know, what the regulator will look at, what the, you know. So when I defined personal safety, I was defining it on that narrow scope, and that I think, you know, those other things you said are certainly important, and looking at the spectrum is certainly important. But I just think that oftentimes, at least in the United States, the leaders, industry leaders, are convinced that they're doing a great job because their occupational health and safety folks bring them these numbers saying how low they've dropped their incident rates. And that's an incomplete picture is what I'm arguing. Yeah.
Does anybody else have anything to add to that?
I'll add one thing. I mean, ballpark, we've got about 450,000 people in this industry, of which, you know, I've said, you know, there's about 25,000 core offshore workers. It's the responsibility of every single one of us who don't travel to and from work in a helicopter to make sure that whatever we do makes it as safe as it possibly can be for the guys and girls who work at site. And I think that's missing. And when you're drawing lines on your CAD station, or buying valves, or recruiting a new person, or signing off on a new structural design, you have to understand that you're playing a part in the long-term safety and the safety performance of that asset. And there is part of that I think is just currently, we've not got that link.
So do you think that the definition between process safety and personal safety is actually stopping those people from becoming involved in that? Because when you say process safety, again, that links to keeping hydrocarbons in the pipes, which is the responsibility of the people working on the asset, not the responsibility of the people supporting in the office. So therefore, is it better to just call it safety and everybody's involved?
I think it's the responsibility of, if the people in the office don't know it's their responsibility, I think we've got to address that. And if that's our tipping point, that's our tipping point.
Thank you. Okay, well, that takes us up to 10:15, and I'm quite keen that we keep on schedule here. Please, don't worry if you didn't get a chance to ask your question, because hopefully, if time allows, at the end of today's conference, we will have another Q&A session. But for the moment, Jake, Susan, Les, Mark, thank you so much for your time. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've found it insightful. And I can ask you now to take your seats again. Thank you.
Thank you.